saying 1:30. So.
I've said like so many embarrassing things that have been quoted and
this is
put
great.
I did an interview with Bloomberg, and they just, instead of doing this podcast, they just wrote it out. I was like, oh wow, I do not speak in complete sentences.
Ready to go? Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the 11th in our series of Front Porch Conversations, which are co-sponsored by the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute, where we engage in conversation with authors of recent research that's relevant to rural America, and we explore the implications for public policy and the well-being of our country overall. I'm Tony Pipa. I'm a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development here at Brookings. I'm a small-town boy from rural Pennsylvania, and I lead an initiative here at Brookings focused on ensuring the effectiveness of federal policy and how it supports community economic development in the U.S. In rural places. And I'm so pleased to be joined, as usual, by my partner and co-host of this series, Brent Orrell, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And not only are Brent and I collaborating on this series, but earlier this year, we jointly launched the America's Rural Future, a bipartisan commission co-chaired by former North Dakota Senator Heidi Heitkamp and former New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu. That's going to be visiting rural places across the country over the next 2 years to develop and put out a national rural strategy by the fall of 2027. We were just recently in North Dakota and Minnesota, and we're going to be visiting other places to hear directly from rural Americans about their future. And you can learn all about that on the America's Rural Future website. So that's a shameless promotion, but you can stay up to date on all of those activities. And I will say that means that these on the front porch sessions take on added meaning because we're going to be using these as inputs for the work of the commission and the issues that they'll be considering and exploring. We're really excited to be joined here today by Suzanne Mettler and Trevor Brown to talk about their recently published book, which you can see right here, Rural versus Urban, The Growing Divide That Threatens Democracy. And I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. You can find links to the recordings of all the front porch conversations we've held on the website of the Reimagining Rural Policy Initiative. And as those of you who've known who have joined us before, we conduct these as informal but well-informed conversations. And so after a discussion amongst ourselves about the book, I'll invite those of you in the audience to join the conversation. And if you're online, you can pose a question to events@brookings.edu when we get to the Q&A. And I also have to say, for sale at the bookstore with a 15% discount is this very book. And the authors are willing to sign afterwards. So if you're here in the audience and you want to seek them out, please do so. But now I want to turn to our guests, Suzanne Mettler, who's the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions with the Department of Government at Cornell University, and Trevor Brown, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Economy and Society at Johns Hopkins University. And together they've written a very timely book. We've seen a rural-urban divide play out during elections, and we certainly hear lots about it from the media. We see it on our screens and in our newspapers, this us versus them mentality. And their book dives into and explores the roots of this political polarization. And so I'll just get started and ask the both of you, give us a little bit of history about the genesis of this book. What prompted it? You know, why write this book and why now?
Great. Well, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. So thank you so much to both of you for inviting us. So both Trevor and I, as it turns out, grew up in rural places, myself in upstate New York and Trevor in Ohio. And I had been noticing for some years that rural politics was changing in upstate New York from what I had seen when I was growing up as a kid there. And things just felt more divisive. And I was really curious about what was going on. There's a political scientist, Catherine Kramer, who wrote a wonderful book, The Politics of Rural Resentment. She focuses in on Wisconsin and finds this growing divide. But I was really curious about, was it broader? Was it, in other regions of the country as well? The other thing that piqued my interest was that in past years, I've been thinking a lot about democracy and learning from scholars who study countries around the world where democracy is in danger of deterioration. And they find that there are some recurrent patterns in terms of the threats to democracy. And one of these is political polarization. So, because as political scientists, we've been seeing rising polarization in the United States, I was just really curious about how places played into that.
Well, give us a sense of, as you did this exploration in the book, what are some of the key themes? What are some of the key takeaways that you would like to lay out for our audience here?
Yeah, and first, I might mention what Trevor and I did in this project. So the backbone of the project is quantitative analysis. Trevor built this big data set, 3,143 counties in the United States, all the counties, with data going from the 1970s all the way up to the present. And that allows us to look at the determinants of presidential voting. And we also did interviews with political party county chairs in various states, in county chairs in rural places, and other kinds of analysis as well. But this county-based analysis, what it revealed to us is that if you look at voting in presidential elections, through the middle of the 20th century, there was almost no difference in how rural and urban places went in the presidential vote. About a 2 percentage point gap. And this is true, both rural and urban places voted by majorities for Nixon and for Reagan and for Clinton the first time he runs for office. That's 1992. There's a 2 percentage point gap between rural and urban places. And then something begins to happen in the 1990s, and this gap grows. And the rural places move more solidly towards supporting the Republican Party, whereas urban places, the biggest cities, had long been supporters of the Democratic Party, but it comes to be, metropolitan areas more generally, suburbs, smaller cities, et cetera, become more supportive of the Democratic Party. So this gap grows from 2 percentage points in 1992 to, in the 2024 election, a 20 percentage point gap between rural and urban places. And that's really huge. And it happens in all regions of the country. You might think, oh, is that just the South? No, it's, it became even larger in the Midwest than the South. The West, it's very large, a little bit less so in the Northeast, but it's in most states of the country. You have this growing divide. And then if you look down, further down the ticket in races, we did analysis of congressional elections as well. And we find that there, starting in the 1990s, there's a growing gap between rural and urban districts in elections for the U.S. House, with Democrats used to win the majority of rural districts in the 1990s for the House. And then it changes over time and becomes much more solidly Republican, and Congress becomes polarized by place. So that's the big puzzle that we start out with.
Yeah, and can folks hear me? First, I just want to thank AEI and Brookings for having us. So a few other takeaways that we should flag up front. First, we sort of offer an explanation for the rural-urban divide, and we describe it as happening sequentially from the 1990s through the early 21st century, and we stress three phenomena that we can sort of get into later. The first starts with the rise of place-based inequality, sort of the growth of the knowledge economy in metro and urban areas on the one hand, and the decline of rural economies in the 1990s through the early 2000s on the other hand. So that's sort of phase one. The second phase starts in 2008 and is marked by sort of two things. First is a growing sense by rural non-Hispanic white people that the Democratic Party is largely made up of urbanites who are highly educated, have comfortable jobs. They feel that urbanites are foisting policies on them, environmental policies especially, but other policies as well, without their input. So that's sort of phase two, one we call elite overreach. And the third phase we stress, or the third prong we stress, is a sort of organizational imbalance between sort of progressives and conservatives in rural areas. So we show that the mobilization of white evangelical churches, NRA-affiliated groups, right to life organizations are disproportionately concentrated in rural areas. And these help mobilize voters. They help connect the dots. Political facts unfortunately don't speak for themselves. Voters often need help, and organizations often provide that help. Second part of the book, we look at the consequences of the rural-urban divide. And one thing I'll stress here up front, and we can sort of discuss more later, is we really do see this as a core threat to democracy at a few different levels. At the institutional level, we know that the electoral arrangements in the United States give rural places outsized power. Now, we would not argue that rural people are dominating American politics. It's 20% of the population at most. But what it does do, as Suzanne mentioned, for the first time in American history, when rural people are consolidated in a political party, it gives them an extra electoral boost that can help them in the Senate, in the Electoral College, but also in the House of Representatives. On the ground, we find through some interviews and some other observational data that it's creating a real strong sort of us versus them politics. Part of the reason why I was became interested in this area of research is I grew up in a rural place in Ohio. Similar to Suzanne's story, I sort of noticed that politics were really changing on the ground, and polarization was happening not just as sort of Republicans versus Democrats, but many of the people I grew up with were viewing the other side of the political aisle as Democrats who lived in cities. The last thing I'll stress here is we find that, contrary to what a lot of people might assume, is that this divide does not boil down to public opinion. We do a pretty exhaustive analysis of the highest quality public opinion data available and find that there are some small gaps on issues related to government spending, on sort of culture war issues, but they're quite small and they can't really explain the growing Syrian divide that Suzanne described so well.
Well, there's a lot there, and so we've got the causes and the consequences, and then I also think we want to try to talk a little bit about what might be some ideas for solutions to address this. But let's stay with the causes, and I want to bring Brent into this conversation as well. But Trevor, you talked about the 90s and about the rise in place-based inequality. Talk a little bit more about that. And I also think it would be interesting to talk about the policy levers that are caught up with that place-based inequality as well, because I think often we think about, well, the economy has just changed and it's become sort of an agglomeration economy or an information economy, and those are disadvantageous to rural places. But I think there's policy decisions that were actually quite caught up with this growing divergence between rural and urban places. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about, like, as you started to study this divergence in voting and this divide, how did it line up with policy decisions and other things economically?
Yeah, sure. So, at the highest level, we show that between 1992 and the early 2000s, place-based inequality is measured by employment growth and population growth are associated in rural areas with, job decline and population decline are associated with Republican vote share. If we want to talk about the sort of mechanisms, there are many, and those vary, I think, across the country. So we know that, for example, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement put particular stress on rural economies. We traditionally think of sort of manufacturing as being a really important part of urban economies, particularly in the post-war era. But in fact, for the latter part of the 20th century, manufacturing was sort of the backbone of a lot of rural economies. Second, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we trace the consolidation of agricultural and farming. So this not only changes the economy, but it changes the very communities in which people are living in. And part of this is driven by sort of decisions about how to enforce antitrust laws and regulations. And the other thing we would just stress is the general sort of push for deregulation among many Republicans and some Democrats appear to have had a significant impact on small businesses in rural areas.
And then you talked also, especially from 2008 on, about the overreach and the suggestion that, these urban elites, especially Democratic, are foisting policies. Talk a little bit about how, and there was a great quote actually, although rural and urban Americans have grown deeply divided in terms of how they vote, this is partisan polarization, not ideological polarization. So there might be similar aims that people living in rural and urban communities have, and yet the way in which policymakers are approaching that, rural folks feel as if they've been sort of impressed upon in some way, or so I don't know. Talk a little bit about that, Suzanne.
Yeah. So to first mention a little bit about what you're saying on public opinion, this is really interesting, and Trevor's already touched on it. That when we look at survey data about people's attitudes about government spending on all sorts of policies, there is almost no difference or no significant difference between rural and urban people on, how much government should be spending on things like healthcare and education, the environment, et cetera. And the same on questions about taxing. If you look at the so-called culture wars questions, you find a gap on abortion, gun rights, immigration, et cetera, but it's not very large and it's not growing. So unlike this voting gap, it's not growing. So it can't by itself explain what's going on with this growing rural-urban divide. But so when we look at, first you've got the rise of place-based inequality, as Trevor's saying, from the 90s into the early 2000s. Then from 2008 onward, there's this subsequent trend that we think really follows up on the first one, that the sequential nature of them is important. And it's an experience by rural people of elite overreach, where they, start to feel like in all these policy areas that are going to affect their lives and their communities, they are not being asked. They're not having a chance to have their voices heard in the policy formation process or implementation process. One important piece of what's happened is an educational divide that's grown. So if you go back to the 1980s, the average American who had a college degree or more was supporting the Republican Party. By the 1990s, that begins to change, where you have these growing numbers of highly educated people. They're living in metropolitan areas. Some of them are working in the knowledge economy, and they begin to gravitate toward the Democratic Party increasingly. Then you get to the period, this 2008 to 2020, where rural people are looking at the party, and it seems like the Democratic Party, it seems like its center of gravity is these highly educated people who they feel do not understand their communities or know much about them, but are creating policies that they need to live by. And they become resentful. So we see resentment as like this subsequent effect after the economic deterioration that happens in the earlier period.
So I want to explore this question of how and where economics plays in this. I'm not convinced, actually, that that the economics is the economic factors are the primary drivers. And for instance, we talk about trade as being a factor. Most of the research now says, that 75–80% of the job loss was really automation rather than trade. So blaming trade, I think, is different than actually backing that up with, yeah, we actually exported jobs. It doesn't seem to be the case. We just got machines to do the work that people were doing. So the other thing that I wanted to throw in there is just like, we're all, well, you're not, Trevor, but the rest of us are old enough to remember.
How old do you think I am?
Not that old. Reagan came in 1980. There was a huge wave, right? That wave actually then receded. And
what kind of wave?
A wave of Republican electeds.
Yes.
It came in behind him, but then that wave receded. By '86, the Democrats had taken back the Senate. They still held the House. They never gave it up. We had Democrats elected statewide in a plethora of offices in what are now considered red states.
Right.
So maybe talk a little bit about the disconnect between national politics and how people think about politics that's a little bit closer to them. Did you tease out in the quantitative research? Oh, by the way, please tell us what rural is, because we're still struggling with what rural is in terms of a definition. But did you tease out kind of like, why did we have two Democratic senators from North Dakota, from Michigan, from, I think, Wisconsin for quite a while, Pennsylvania? I mean, these are now the flashpoints of this divide. But that is really a recent development. I mean, that's 10, 15 years of change.
Yeah. Yes. Though there's so much to answer here.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, I had to get everything
no,
out.
That's okay. Yeah. Well, I think I'll go first back to the New Deal. So, in the 1920s, rural areas in the United States were really hurting. There was really already an agricultural recession, at least, happening in the 1920s across the country. And then the Great Depression hits, and rural areas are even worse off. As Franklin D. Roosevelt gets elected, and people are coming to Washington, there was one member of Congress who said he feared there was going to be revolt in the countryside because people were so upset and there was such need and despair. I was fascinated in this project to really learn, as I had not before, the extent to which Roosevelt put rural areas front and center in the New Deal. My first book that I wrote in my career was about the New Deal, but I somehow missed this. It was fascinating to look at it with these questions and to realize that what Roosevelt was doing was building a big rural and urban coalition. And he really prioritized rural places in terms of the appointments, like his brain trust, were these economists who focused on agriculture, and then in all sorts of policies that they rolled out, from those that helped people who were engaged in farming and agriculture, but also rural electrification and the Tennessee Valley Authority, and on and on. And rural people saw that. They felt that the Democratic Party, with Roosevelt leading it, had helped them out, had saved them in the Great Depression, and they remembered it and they passed it on to their children. And that image of the Democratic Party as being there for the average person stuck with rural areas all the way up into the 1990s. And then the question for us is, then what happened, And we do not, I think, your question's a fair one. Is it automation? Is it trade? Whatever. And we don't get into all of that. What we do know is that in the 90s and early 2000s, rural counties that were losing jobs or that had lower job growth were moving toward Republican voting, and those that were losing population were doing the same. And so, then the question is, what's going on? An interesting thing about that period is that NAFTA, whether or not it was the cause of all of this, it was highly visible to people. So here you have a Democratic president in the White House, and he is promoting NAFTA. Many Democratic members of Congress were not, including the leadership. I had the opportunity to interview Richard Gephardt, who, at that time was strongly against NAFTA and spoke with President Clinton about it on several occasions. Clinton said to him, well, I'll send you to Mexico. You can negotiate a deal with them that you're comfortable with, that will, treat labor well. And Gephardt tried it. It was unsuccessful. So he came back, and then he and David Bonnier really rallied Democrats in Congress against NAFTA. And all labor unions in the country were against NAFTA, and they really had, made a big push against it. They were joined by lots of other organizations. So it was highly visible. So then NAFTA ultimately gets passed in Congress with, pretty solid Republican support and a number of Democrats, but the majority of Democrats in each chamber were against it. But what the public saw is our party has deserted us because, they'd been getting that message from this whole campaign. So I think that was really important. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I'll add two things on the economics, and then I'll let you know how we define rural or how others define it. On Suzanne's point on the economics, I think it's a fair question. What's really driving economic dislocation? A thing to emphasize what Suzanne is getting at, but I'll just put a fine point on, is, voters are not fools, but they also, there's a question of blame attribution when things are not going well. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that Republicans have done a much better job at blaming Democrats, more effective job for rural decline. Michael Shepard's done some good research on this, and with rural hospital closures, for example. There's also just sort of increasing econometric research that shows that places that were heavily affected by NAFTA and the China trade shock, there were political effects to those. Now we can sort of argue or discuss how big the sort of NAFTA or China shock was in terms of the overall sort of distribution of job losses, but those do appear to have political effects that tended to drive non-Hispanic rural white people to the Republican Party. This something we find and that other scholars find. How do we define rural? There are a lot of ways to define rural. We use the Office of Management and Budgets, non-metro and metro classification. We use it because it's a fairly parsimonious and we think effective measurement. It's not perfect. It essentially sort of describes whether or not a county is rural or urban based on its population density and whether or not it's hooked into a larger metro area. When you buy the book and read it, be sure to read the appendix. We use a few other measures of rural, and those tend to be robust with, or those are robust with what we find in the book.
So let me follow up on not on the trade versus automation, but where does the civil rights revolution fit in your analysis? Because I mean, it's interesting, right? Because President Johnson thought that he had lost the South for a generation. Yeah. Actually took almost a generation for that loss to show up, maybe a little bit more than a generation for it to show up. But so that's a cultural factor. It's legal, it's political, it's cultural. how does that show up in your analysis?
Well,
I'll just make a small point and then you can elaborate. It's really interesting that rural areas stuck with the Democratic Party all the way until the 1990s. So they did not, after the civil rights era moved to the Republican Party, it seemed that more urban areas in the South were moving in that direction initially, which is really fascinating to see. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to sort of make the same point that the timing really sort of doesn't add up as just an explanatory thing. I mean, we're late into the 1990s and rural areas are still voting for many Democrats.
I mean, I think this is really a generational question. I mean, I was actually working for Southern Democrats in that mid to late 80s and into the mid 90s when, state of Georgia had 2 Republican senators and like 80% of the congressional delegation of the House delegation are all Democrats.
Yes.
And it really struck me because, I mean, I was relatively young then, in looking at sort of the networks of supporters, they were getting old. These were people who they were hereditary Democrats. They supported candidates who struck a pretty moderate line on economics, national defense, or national security issues. But I mean, so age demographics, is that part of the explanation that we saw a generational change?
Well, I do think that as the Democratic brand, if you will, began to become unpopular in rural areas, sort of at the national level, people were sometimes still willing to elect that person, that Democrat they'd been electing for a long time because, that's Bob. We know Bob. We trust Bob. He's not like those other crazy Democrats around the country. And then once Bob was gone, then it did change things. But we see, these larger factors as overriding in terms of what's driving it at the county level, the change.
But let me pick up on what Brent was also implying just with the civil rights revolution, because later on you talk about sort of where race comes into this later, right? Into the later 2000s and even 2020. And it goes back to that second sequence of sort of overreach, like what you call elite overreach, and talk about those perceptions, especially amongst white rural Americans, of where race plays into it because of this elite overreach.
Yeah, so this is great. So we should be clear that the rural-urban divide that we're talking about here is largely being driven by non-Hispanic rural white voters. African Americans, Latino voters in rural and urban areas tend to vote for the Republican and Democratic Party at similar rates. So when we think about the rural-urban political partisan divide, it's largely driven by non-Hispanic white people. Now, not all rural America is white. According to the rural measure we use, about 1 in 4 rural dwellers are identify as people of color. Now, sort of how does racism and elite overreach play in here? So, as Suzanne mentioned, we really do think the sort of like the sort of first order cause starts with sort of the material deterioration in rural areas, and then starting in 2008. Through 2020, we track anti-Black racism through an attitudinal question among non-Hispanic rural whites and urbanites back to the 1980s. And what's pretty interesting here is we find that there's actually a very small gap in anti-Black racism between rural and urban dwellers. It's not until 2016 and 2020 that a small but important gap starts to open up, and that's when anti-Black racism among rural dwellers begins to become associated with voting for the Republican Party. So anti-Black racism does matter. It is one part of the broader argument we're making. And to tie it back to the elite overreach, part of the argument we make is that the Democratic Party is not just sort of being perceived as this party that's, catering to urban elites who wear sort of ties and shirts like me, graduated college, and so on and so forth, but also as a party that's catering to minorities racial minorities who live in urban areas. Cities have long been coded as Black by the media, as Marty Gillen's research shows.
Which is super interesting because as part of the Rural Commission work that we've been doing, if you look just at the dysfunction side of rural America, a lot of good things happening in rural America, a lot of very promising, hopeful things, and we don't want to get... Oh, okay, sorry. There's a lot of good things happening, and rural areas are actually some of the very best places in terms to live in terms of socioeconomic outcomes. But when you look at the deficit side of the ledger on socioeconomic questions, rural America looks a lot like some of our most distressed areas in our urban counties. Same problems, actually, with drugs, violence, educational failure, you name it.
Underinvestment, yeah.
Yeah, you name it. You're seeing exactly the same patterns, and yet there's no identity of interest between them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I have nothing to add to it except to underscore it that, that is evident to us that there is great economic need in both rural and urban places. And that's really striking.
Well, and it relates back to the race point, right? Because if you are in communities if you're part of a rural community that is really struggling, really suffering under adverse circumstances, the rural white voters, you're looking at, it's not true, it's not fair, actually, but you're thinking, why are the Black people getting all of the attention? We're just as hard up. We're struggling just as much. Yeah. Now, that's the reason I say that isn't fair is because, of course, we are transferring enormous amounts of money from urban areas into rural areas to fund safety net programs. These are recipient states, not donor states. So it's not a reality, but it is a cultural, I think, flashpoint that's built on, it taps into that resentment question.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. I mean, I think about a Republican Party county chair in northern Michigan in the Lower Peninsula who said to me, Democrats just have no understanding of how we live here and what's important to us here. There's really that feeling of a disconnect with the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party is elites who, are not paying attention to needs in rural places. I agree.
And then you look at something like, during the Biden administration, massive amounts of money being pushed into rural communities, and still no recognition of just how much assistance is going.
Yeah, that was a question I was going to bring up. If there's this conception of elite overreach, it seems that elite becomes equated with Democrat.
Right.
Rather than elite, like there's not elite Republicans, it's interesting. And it's also a little paradoxical in that if the electoral system sort of provides disproportionate allowance for like minority or for rural places to have a say in the elections, but yet they still aren't feeling, those places still aren't feeling as if their realities are taking into account during decision making. But it seems like it's only blaming one set of actors for that rather than everybody who's like in Washington. It would be interesting. Just talk about that a little bit, like help us think that through a little bit.
Well,
I've done it again. I would just, sort of point to the research that we've done on the role that organizations are playing. Again, I said this earlier, this is a quote from VOK, but voters are not fools, but voters also need help in understanding politics. Voters, we're in DC right now. A lot of folks who work at think tanks are in the audience. Great. Thank you for coming. We spend all of our time thinking about politics. Average everyday voters don't do that. They're busy. And so the organizational imbalance in rural America really matters. So there are NRA groups that we talk about in the book that are disproportionately in rural areas, white evangelical churches and right to life groups. And these groups have really found a way to insert themselves in the day-to-day lives of white rural Americans in a way that organizations associated with the Democratic Party have not. On the flip side, one development that we chart in the book is the decline of labor unions in rural America. Now, labor unions often associated with urban areas, and there's a measurement question here. It's tricky to actually tease out where unions are. We have a new measure in the book that looks at electoral activity. As manufacturing became really important in rural America, and as coal and other extractive industries were really important to those economies, unions actually did play an important role in rural America in helping voters sort of connect the dots and helping sort of reduce polarization. And so to sort of like land the plane a little bit here, the organizational development really matters in terms of like who gets blamed for feeling like they're being left out.
Yeah. And, the situation now in rural places, the kind of places where we went to do these interviews, is that the Democratic Party, we met with all of these Democratic Party chairs. They'll tell stories like this. They'll say, I'm 65 years old. I decided a few years ago to start attending the meetings of the Democratic Party. Everyone else there is in their 80s and 90s. I quickly got asked to be an officer. And then a few months later, I became the chair. And we heard that story again and again. And they feel that, they have a tiny number of people. They're all volunteers. They're doing what they can, but it's not so much that they can do. The Republican Party, both the Democratic and Republican Party at the local level have suffered for decades for the reasons that civic associations have generally, the kind of story that Robert Putnam tells in Bowling Alone. That we've talked to some Republicans in places where the party now is really has a lot of new momentum and a lot of people are coming out to meetings, but that's not always true. But where it's not true, the party is being helped by these organizations that Trevor mentions, whereas the Democrats don't have those social networks of organizations helping them. So they will say, in each election, it's a heavy lift. We have to start over all over again. So what happens is, here you have President Biden's administration rolled out more policies that were really geared to distressed counties, including rural counties, than any president had probably since going back to FDR. But, a question we have, and this is not something we explore in the book, but we're curious about, is how much did rural people know that? My guess is very little. And the reason why is because there wasn't that infrastructure there of a strong organization that could connect the dots for them and to say, oh, look at this policy that came along and here's what it's done for us and here's how it's affected us locally in our community.
So Brent and I have a couple more questions just to the audience. We'll get to you after a couple more questions. And if you're online, events@brookings.edu for your questions. I want to shift us a little bit to the consequences that you talked about. And it's in the title of the book. the growing divide that threatens democracy. Okay. So why do you say that? What concerns you about this divide? What is the connection to democracy in the way in which you really see this as a danger for the country?
Yeah, so there are a couple different levels. I'll take the sort of institutional level. So I want to start this off by saying we don't find evidence, and I don't think other scholars have found much evidence that rural Americans are especially authoritarian in their outlook. But they are increasingly voting for the Republican Party. And so if you combine an increasingly sort of hollowed out extreme Republican Party with a small but important electoral advantage, you end up with, again, a Republican Party that's not only extreme, but also advantaged, as we show in the book, advantaged in the Senate. It's advantaged through the Electoral College. We know that President Trump won the Electoral College in 2016 without winning the popular vote. The last 10 times the Republican Party has held the Senate, 10 out of the last 12 times the Republican Party has held the majority in the Senate. They've come from lower populated states, more rural states that do not actually represent the majority of the country. Moreover, the rural-urban divide also gives the Republican Party an advantage in the U.S. House of Representatives because urban voters are so concentrated in these urban districts. They end up wasting a lot of votes, whereas rural and Republican voters are much more efficiently distributed. And so the combination of the sort of like institutional advantage this gives to the Republican Party and an increasingly extreme Republican Party, we think is a massive threat to democracy. And Suzanne will probably want to talk about some of the stuff we heard on the ground.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of points to that. There's also, in rural places, this means being subjected to one-party government. Where, you don't really have a choice in elections. So, the Democratic political party chairs that we talked to, they would say it was getting harder and harder to get candidates to run down the ballot for all of these races because they would say, what's the point? And then when they weren't able to field a full slate of candidates, then they would have Democratic voters calling them and saying, why should I even vote? We don't have Democratic candidates running. So you get kind of like these vicious cycle kinds of dynamics that occur and that leave rural places with really just one party. And then for that party, it's easy for it to become more extremist because then it's the primary election that becomes important, not the general election. And we've seen this the national trends that the Republican Party has over time been electing people who are further and further to the right, more extreme positions. And if you're in a place where they're not going to be facing a real competitor in the general election, it's much easier for that to happen. So that's one whole set of things. And then the final thing is that you add up everything we've both said, and this leads nationally to us versus them kinds of politics. And I think that's exacerbated by its geographic characteristic that, it's very easy to stereotype people if you never interact with them. And if you live far away from them, you can think all kinds of things about them. So I find myself in conversations with people who will tell me that rural people are bigoted and racist and all kinds of things. And I'll say, well, in fact, the data doesn't really bear that out. And and also I come from a rural place and those are stereotypes and I take issue with stereotyping a whole group of people. But it's easy to do that if you don't interact with people. And that's really dangerous for democracy more broadly.
So I'm going to swerve back the other direction here from where Tony was trying to take us because this is my last chance to ask a question. Typically in American history, when a region is hit by economic adversity, natural disaster, you name it, people pick up and move. Where, what role did you look at all at the role of mobility, the declining mobility of Americans generally speaking, and what role that plays, and is it a big factor in rural America?
Yeah. Do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. This is a great question. A few thoughts. I mean, just generally, in part because of how expensive cities are right now, it's really difficult to move. Jacob Arbenter, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell, is doing some really great research on the role that housing prices are playing and this dramatic decline in economic mobility. So that's certainly part of it, and we have comparative research showing that sort of right-wing populism, as comparativists tend to call it, tends to be facilitated by not just the sort of economic dislocation that Suzanne and I write about, but frankly, the inability of people who do want to move, their inability to move to cities, they feel stuck in place. So there's that dynamic's definitely playing out. But a lot of people we talk to, and Suzanne can speak more to this than I can, frankly, they don't want to move. Like, this is their place, this is their community. I currently live in Baltimore. There's economic dislocation there. A lot of people don't want to move because Baltimore is their home. I could say the same thing about rural Ohio, where my family lives. It would probably be economically advantageous for them to move to Columbus, but they like their home just outside of Donaldsonville, Ohio, that in fact has not just one but two front porches.
Suzanne, do you want to add to that or no? Okay, so let's. I think one of the interesting portions of the book too is so what are solutions? Like how do we think about this? How do we come back or come more together as a country around this? And I think one of the interesting things that you say is that you suggest a great deal of skepticism that policy is actually going to be the thing that addresses this divide. So talk a little bit about this. Tell us a little bit about how you think about what the next steps we need to take as a country to sort of lessen this divide.
This is a surprising thing for me to hear myself say, because all of my work previously had been about public policy.
There's a lot of that going around right now. Yeah.
And yeah, you know, when we look at rural areas, there, you know, as Brent, you were saying, they're using at least as much or more on a per capita basis of social welfare policies from the federal government compared to urban areas. And then you've got these new policies rolled out by the Biden era and so on. And where that ultimately leaves us is saying that policy by itself, as much as it's no doubt needed, and rural areas probably need all sorts of creative, innovative policies to help them out, but we don't think it's sufficient for closing this divide and healing us versus them politics, because at this point the animosity is so high, and so we think that what's necessary is organizing at the local level by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party needs to take it upon itself to, instead of abandoning rural areas, go back to rural places and help all of those county party chairs that I'm describing and really give them support to be there year in and year out, to engage in listening. We think it's really important for the Democratic Party to have serious listening to rural people, to find out how they're perceiving the party and what their needs are. And then to try to be responsive to that, to try to rebuild relationships. And this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to take a long time. But it's what all of the county chairs emphasized, is that relationship building is key to this kind of organizing, because you have to establish trust. And so that's really where we end up. You want to add anything to?
Yeah, I would just sort of add that I think it's important that both the Republican and Democratic Party become actually existing political parties again as institutions. So for the reason that Suzanne mentioned, it's important for Democrats to be sort of present in the Democratic Party, to be present in rural America, because 30%, we chart this divide, it is a Syrian divide, but there are still 30% of rural residents identify as Democrats. So they deserve a party that represents them. Two-party competition, vital to democracy. On the Republican side, some of the organizations we mentioned, white evangelical churches who mobilize voters, right to life groups that mobilize voters, NRA groups who mobilize voters, they don't necessarily represent the median voter or the median Republican voter either. So sort of point about party building applies to both Democrats and, I would argue, Republicans as well.
So let me just ask one question before we then go to the audience. Well, I'll ask two questions. One is, it's almost as if I hear you saying the Democratic Party needs to reinvest in rural America for the sake of the country. But if I'm a Democratic operative and I'm trying to think about if I win or lose as a party, like, you're asking me to spend money on a losing proposition that might be good for the country overall, but like at the end of the day, I'm not sure it's going to be good for my party. So that's one question. And the second is, we haven't talked at all about media. And when Brent and I talked to Nick Jacobs at Colby College on the analysis that he and Dan Shea had done on the rural voter, they talked about sort of the media ecosystem and the stories that people were hearing and also telling about their places and what they're hearing about also Washington, D.C. And so wondering how you all think about that, what your work, how did media and the media ecosystem actually intersect with the work and your findings as well? But one is are we asking the Democratic Party to sort of bring us back to a two-party rule? But, that's going to cost a lot of money and a lot of time. And in the meantime, they got elections to win and things like that. So
yeah. I think for the Democratic Party that wants to win elections, this is crucial. Okay. I'll give you an example for, the U.S. Senate, as, Trevor is explaining, it really like overrepresents areas that have less population. And Democrats really are not going to have a chance to be really making progress on their policy agenda unless they can figure out a way to win back the Senate. And that is going to take engaging rural areas, right? But I think of interviews that we did in Georgia with rural political party county chairs, and several of those Democrats in far-flung corners of the state were so proud of the role they believed they had played in getting Senators Warnock and Ossoff elected. And the reason why is what they tried very hard to do was to lose by less in their county. They would say, if I could get the Democratic candidate for a statewide office, in this case for the Senate, to get not 34% of the vote here, but 37% of the vote, and that happens in other rural places, they're going to win. And they really believe that they made the difference. So losing by less is a strategy that I think will not take a long, long time to benefit Democrats. But then I think, if Democrats really want to be winning at other levels, they just have to re-engage. And there's every reason to do so because, as we've been saying, there are needs that are, the kinds of needs the Democratic Party traditionally has tried to address that are in rural areas as well as urban.
Yeah, I think Suzanne covered most of it. I'd also just say that political parties have some responsibility not just to win elections, but to also represent their constituencies and those who identify with the party. And like I said, 30% of rural America identifies as a Democrat right now, despite the sort of rightward turn of rural America. So the operatives are in the room, or if you want to have a chat afterwards, it's not just about winning elections, but you also have a responsibility to your constituents. There's a great question about the media. We know from other political scientists and sociologists that local news has been on the decline in recent decades because of data limitations. We were unfortunately unable to study it in this book, but we have a strong hunch that it plays some role.
Okay, well, let's go to the audience, and I'll start with my colleague EJ. Dion.
Thank you. I'm still thinking about that youthful 65-year-old being willing to be a Democratic Party chair. God bless him. First of all, thank you to the Commission for the work it's doing, which in some ways is a direct response to this book, even though it predated the publication of this book. And thank you for the book. You both know how much I admire it. I have two questions. One is, and I think we've talked about this, I find much more persuasive the argument that rural Americans feel metropolitan Democrats are indifferent to them or don't pay attention to them, than that they resent decisions imposed upon them by these elites. I mean, you're right about NAFTA. I've seen it in my own hometown. And you have an interesting section there about rural, a windmill project, I guess, which made me want to sort of study more how green energy projects are received in rural America. But there isn't a lot of survey data that's persuasive. I find far more persuasive your argument that it's about indifference. To answer Tony's question, there's a kind, or to suggest a question from Tony's question, there's almost a vicious cycle here. Democrats underinvest in these areas because they can't win them. Mm-hmm. Therefore, when Biden throws all this money at rural America, Democrats never advertise about it because they can't win, and so nothing changes. So I find sort of a sense of being ignored far more persuasive than the sense of imposition. The other question I have is, one of the most interesting things about Abigail Spanberger's election in Virginia last month is she made real inroads into rural Virginia, really big swings in some of those rural counties. She invested time and money there. I'm curious if you looked at that, and if you haven't yet, it would be great for the second edition of the book, because I think it's a very interesting case where it's the first case I've seen since your book is published that there is actually some real possibility. And she didn't carry all those counties, but it sure helped her build a very big margin. So indifference versus imposition and Virginia. And again, thanks for this event and the book. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you, EJ. Well, I think both things are at play and that lead to kind of resentment of the Democratic Party, whether it's, and I think about in interviews, I heard both things from people. They're ignoring us, they don't care about us, they don't understand us, and they're telling us what to do. So I think they're two sides of the same coin. We do a look at renewable energy that gets rolled out in rural places, and we're drawing here on a pretty vast literature with case studies from all over the country where you get the same basic story, that whether it's windmills or solar energy that's being rolled out, that it happens in rural places by, some developer comes along, cuts a deal with a large landowner in the area. And all of this happens before the community knows about it. And then people learn about it and they say, oh, well, we would have liked to have been asked as a community, and we would like to have had some input on the siting and so on. And so that's the kind of thing where people really feel like the Democratic Party is out of touch with them as it's promoting those kinds of policies. With Abigail Spanberger, we have not analyzed that, but it would be great to. I think it highlights how showing up really matters. And, I heard various stories from rural county party chairs about statewide candidates in their states who did not bother to come and campaign there. And it's such an affront to them. And people really remember that.
Okay, other questions? I'll go to this side now. Person in the front, and please state your name before your question as well. Thanks.
Hold on, microphone first.
I'm Doug Addison from CFFAD,
And what I've noticed in this discussion is that a lot of it is structured
Can you
over-
put your mic up a little bit? Okay.
A lot of the discussion is structured around Democrat versus Republican.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of polling that shows that a lot of Americans don't feel comfortable with either party. And I'm just working my way through Lee Drutman's book, the two-party doom loop. So I'm wondering if in your studies, even if you haven't looked at this question directly, how would you assess the possibility of third and fourth parties in the rural and urban divide question? Thanks.
So generally speaking, political scientists will say that, third parties, well, if they get really organized and they introduce a single issue that's not being addressed by either party, that can make a difference. But generally speaking, given our electoral institutional arrangements, third parties end up being like spoilers and people don't vote for them. However, what I would say is that I think there are some parts of the country in rural areas where the Democratic brand is so deeply damaged that it may make sense to have a period of time there where people would run as independents. And there was one former senator who remains anonymous, but he said, I don't know that someone running as a Democrat could win in my state again in any time in the near future. I think they might have to use a different name. And so, it's very interesting what's happening in Nebraska with an independent candidate running again. And we'll have to see how that goes. But there might be something to be said for that.
And just, I would second all of what Suzanne says there. The sort of point about the electoral institutions is really important because we've seen the rural-urban divide grow in other advanced democracies over time. What tends to happen in countries, though, with multi-party systems is sort of more radical rural parties tend to form on their own, and they tend to be locked out of governing coalitions. But in the United States, we have two parties. Both of them are fairly hollowed out as institutions, and yeah.
Can I just
Go ahead.
one comment on this?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I'm living in a room where all of the heuristic China has been shattered. We just don't have the definitions that we need. So this is one of them. Third parties can't succeed. Is that still true? I mean, has the gap between the public and the parties become so severe that I understand all of the, ballot access things and, those kinds of challenges, but I'm not so sure. Like maybe that can change too. So
Let's go online to an online question. Krista, I'll turn to you.
Sure. We've got an online question from a student at Georgetown. Questions about priorities of the Hispanic population in rural counties, especially those working in agriculture, farming, and ranching. When deciding how to vote, are they more concerned about immigration policies or about conservative values, and why?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. We because of the data limitations, it's difficult to sort of like drill down into the sort of priorities of a population that hasn't been oversampled in rural areas. But what we do know is that the priorities of Hispanic Americans in rural areas aren't that much different, and their policy viewpoints are just not that much different than those in urban America. And they tend to vote for the Democratic Party at roughly the same rate as those in urban areas.
Over here, I've got, right there.
I don't have a question per se. I'm finding this very
If you
interesting.
state your name, please.
Oh, Lois Forrester. I'm finding this very interesting as I grew up on a farm in the Midwest, and even as not that long ago. I was still going back to the farm for various reasons, although my dad died in 2023. You know, we were having to sell the farm and go through a number of issues sorted with that. And I was kind of different in my family in terms of, yes, I did those hard chores that kids don't do these days. You wouldn't find a kid, maybe on a farm somewhere, that would do the kind of things we had to do as kids, and my dad had to do, and my grandfather had to do to survive. I mean, my parents weren't rich. They couldn't send me to college, but somehow, some way, I found my way to college, and they said, we can't give you a loan. But I still love my parents because they worked hard to give us something. I also went to become a land use planner and worked in that county for a while with 26 county board members and majority Republicans. So I knew about that, the urban-rural divide in terms of land use and trying to get them to understand some of the issues out there. It's probably the same today, maybe. I assume it's maybe even worse. But I have to say, going back and forth many times a year, I have to blame Fox News, which isn't news, not what they were watching. I have to blame Newt Gingrich. I have to blame a lot of other people. And what I'd like to see more today is not necessarily convincing rural America you have to become democratic, but convincing rural America that these policies should work for you and that moderate Republicans could help in this cause as well. And, you know, farmers now today aren't finding markets. I mean, they're crashing, and they're going to continue to crash for years on end. They become upended.
Okay, thank you. So it's a good point, though. Like, is it about rebuilding the Democratic brand, or is it also just about making local communities work and feeling connected to the political system overall? I think is one strain out of that. But the second strain out of it, and we haven't really talked about it as well, is what about the youth in rural America and how they are actually participating in the system, and what does that mean also for the future of this divide? So I think those are two different kind of strains of questions that we can take from that comment.
Yeah. So many of the county chairs, both Democrats and Republicans, say, you know, the young people don't stay here. Why would they? There's nothing here for them, which was, you know, made people really sad that all of their children are moving away. You know, I think the goal is to have, for democracy to be strong, that means that there is authority coming from we the people electing officials to represent us, and they actually do by creating policies that are responsive to local needs and values. And the problem with where we are right now is that that's not happening. That's being interrupted. And I will welcome any party who can do that in rural America. I think that's the issue. Right now, rural America is you know, being sustained on a kind of grievance politics that comes out of this resentment of the sequential polarization we've described. But I think that that can only go so far. That doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't give you health care. It doesn't allow your kids to go to college. And so if a party can show up there, really listen to people, and then respond with policies that help with those things, I think they can make a real difference.
Yeah, I'll just underscore Suzanne's point that, you know, we'd say that any community, local level, national level, state level, needs a competitive party system. And I don't want to speculate too much, but I've lived in cities since moving away from rural America, and not run especially well, and that's in part because there are Democrats who are elected without a lot of competition in those cities. So the point is really about competition and not sort of one party or the other.
Yeah, so one party rule does not a healthy democracy make, whether it's in a city or whether it's in a rural place. I guess one thing I would say is I've seen, especially in the work that we're doing and even in the visits we've made through the commission, but the work that I do through the podcast, shameless promotion, Reimagine Rural, find it wherever you listen, charts the towns and what's happened, positive change actually happening in rural towns.
And directly relevant this most recent episode to this conversation.
Yes, because it's on a data center. And again, we're talking about local control and the extent to which local people get to steer what's happening in their situation outside both state legislation and outside investments coming in to put a data center into the middle of a town that wasn't consulted at all, for example. But to your point about youth, and there's nothing for me here, and I look to Fiona Hill, our colleague, as the title of her book. I do think many rural places are seeing that their future is tied to getting their young people to see opportunities there rather than escaping as the rule. And we are seeing, I think, rural places that are starting to do better are having some success in that. So I think that there is actually an untapped potential for young people. And the younger people who are coming back to rural areas are doing so because they want to make a difference, actually. Rural places are very flat hierarchies. You can get a lot done with a few people. And I think that's one attractive thing. And so I think that could be part of the prescription maybe for what we're talking about here. But I'm going to go back to the audience, and Fiona, I'll go to you since we've talked about the title of your book now like 3 different times. So.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona Hill. And actually, you answered one of the questions that actually my colleague Caroline and I had about youth in rural areas. But this is related because I think, as other people have already asked, I mean, this has been framed understandably through the competition in the party system because of the local chapters of Republican parties or Democratic parties. You've talked at great length about other institutions and organizations that are there. But I wonder if you could take that a little bit further, because as Tony's just said, there are a lot of younger people who are thinking about staying in rural areas. And I've spent actually a lot of time going around rural areas in both America and the UK, but also in Germany. And in East Germany, where we're seeing all the same kind of problems of polarization, the alternative for Deutschland taking off, it's because, just like you said, there are no unions, because under East Germany, the unions were subsumed by the Communist Party. And often the only representation in these towns that are kind of semi-rural and used to be industrial, but all the industry is being closed down, is the police or schools. And so the German government was trying to, with a huge transfer of money, try to get rural or semi-rural areas in Germany to build up other institutions, but doing it from the top down hasn't obviously really got a lot of traction. And in the UK, you've got actually a big infrastructure of civic organisations. You've got the Women's Institute, which is actually set up in rural Wales in 1914 to address problems in the rural economy when everybody went off to fight in World War I. You've got all kinds of things like that, for example. So I'm wondering about what do we still have in rural America? Community colleges in rural areas. You used to have farmers' cooperatives, even if you've lost unions. And Dan Osborne in Nebraska has talked about creating a kind of Main Street for small towns movement, even if he doesn't get elected, to try to get people more engaged in kind of a sort of civic activity. But you've got so many remote rural areas in the United States that actually that seems quite difficult, because they don't actually even have any kind of larger town anywhere near them, even on the 10,000 to 49,999 or whatever your definition was. So, I mean, what could you see as being other parts of that fabric, institutional and otherwise, high schools, football teams, baseball teams, what else could we see out there?
Yeah, it's kind of sort of the other side of the coin of organizational dynamics that you talked about as part of the factors as well. Maybe the organizational dynamics can actually come back to be a place that rebuilds through that divide as well.
Yeah. Thank you for that great question. I'll start out and turn it to you. Yeah, yeah. Community colleges are something that we looked at, and there are actually more community colleges per capita in rural parts of the United States than in urban. And so I think that could be promising. I like that idea that you have of, trying to rebuild civic engagement around different kinds of institutions. And, it's also true of institutions of higher education generally. It's striking how many of our institutions are, like Cornell University in pretty rural parts of the country. And so I think that building, using them to rebuild could be one strategy.
Yeah, the other, I didn't get to. I'm a little rural resentful right now. Rurally resentful. I didn't get to mention why I started the research, but now's my chance. In my home county, Clark County, Ohio, we claim to have founded 4-H. I don't know if this is actually true. It seems that a lot of counties claim that they founded 4-H, but there are 4-H's, so they could have founded one of them. So 4-H is another one. It was a vibrant civic institution. We've talked with people who are currently organizing on the ground in rural America in places that are both electorally competitive and not electorally competitive. And one institution that came up over and over again was 4-H. For those in the audience who don't know, it's a civic organization associated with farming and raising animals for farms.
We've had some.
Out that I was in 2 4-H clubs when I was a kid.
I'm going to go toward the back here. We have a woman in the glasses that's been eager to get in. And then, Krista, I'm coming to you for an online question as well. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Ash with Second Mountain Strategies. Very excited to buy and hopefully get some signatures in my book.
There you go.
Excellent. So thank you for the work on the commission as well. I'm interested in coming back to the topic of the consequences of the rural-urban divide, and specifically on state and local policy. I think for those of us who work with lawmakers at the state and local level, especially on the Democratic side, who are making investments in rural communities, this negative feedback loop and narrative around we're making these investments, but there doesn't necessarily tend to be a translation into greater public investment into social programs, affordable housing, economic and workforce development, kind of the list goes on. So I'm interested to hear, did you do any analysis or find any correlation between places with a greater rural and urban divide and what impact that had on public investment, public spending, specifically in social programs? And I wonder, because I think this narrative challenge is especially interesting in purple states, where we have a divide of leadership, whether that be in the governor's office, the legislature, and our congressional representatives. So yeah, I'd love just to hear if you did any of that analysis.
Yeah. You want to take it? Yes, I am sorry to say that we don't do state level analysis. We talked about it, over the 5-year period, like, yeah, we should get to state level analysis. And then at some point we were like, that's for another book, not this one.
In 300 pages, we were like,
yeah, but I'm really curious about what you're saying. And I think it would be really valuable for someone to do that next level of analysis, because, as you were saying, state governments have really changed over this same time period in terms of control. And, we know with things like expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, for example, there are states like Texas that have not adopted that, and Texas has more rural people than any other state in the country, and many who are in a lot of need and could really use those benefits. So great questions that I'm sorry we haven't answered.
Krista, you want to come through online?
Yes, so we have somebody, they work with the Civic Health Project, which is part of the National Bridging Divides movement. I'm curious what the panelists think of the work being done by many grassroots organizations focused on bridging the urban-rural divide, such as Urban Rural Action. Do you see them having any real impact?
Yeah, and there's Braver Angels, and there's a host of organizations that have really grown up to put people in relationship with each other. As you were saying, Susan, before, it's easy to stereotype those that you actually don't even know.
Right. Yeah, we did not study these organizations, but we're actually now learning a lot about them. We've been having conversations with leaders of various of these organizations just since the book came out, and we're really interested in what they're doing and hope to learn more.
Yeah, and I would just add, you know, an important part of the argument we make about institutions building, and a lot of these groups have been at this for a while, is that this actually just takes a long time. Like the time horizon of an elected official and their staffers is just way different than the time horizon, unfortunately, oftentimes for the health of democracy and for reducing polarization. So, you know, we might not immediately see effects from grassroots organizations in year 1, 2, 3, 4, but we know that over time they can make a real difference.
I'm going to go to the right here. We've had a hand up in the back for a while.
Ibrahim Mukman. I'm a retired community development consultant, but one of the things that bothers me, someone talked about on the panel, the whole issue of stereotyping. I'm a Muslim, and I've been the victim of that. I remember when
If you could put the mic a little closer. Thank you.
when Osama bin Laden was doing stuff, people said, why aren't you doing something to deal with that? And when you have the people like the president who denigrates a whole group of people like Somalians and other things, and people, rural areas and other places don't speak out against that, that to me, that's a very bad threat to democracy. I think about when you were talking about we the people, my great-grandfather came here from Nigeria. He was enslaved. And so we the people, when people get ready to celebrate next year, 250 years, he was considered property. So we need to call out people who try and stereotype whole groups of people, whether it's by your race or what country you come from or whatever.
Yeah, we absolutely agree. And so, you know, what we are suggesting in the end of the book is that there needs to be organizing done on the ground in rural places so that there is another message. You know, I think of a county chair that we spoke with in eastern Ohio, who, you know, he was talking about Fox News and, you know, all that people were hearing from this media ecosystem. And he said the problem is that there's no other voice here shouting from the rooftops, you know, a different message. And so I think you're absolutely right, and that's what's needed.
Well, and he also mentioned the 250th anniversary that's coming up.
Yeah.
Is that a possibility for us to make some headway on this divide in some way? How would you think about large national, you know, efforts like that that traditionally have tried to at least unite us as a country?
Well, I think, you know, we are in such a divisive time, but people who believe that we need to, you know, all be united as one people and do things for the greater good, we need to be claiming this opportunity to speak about the values that are deeply ensconced in the Declaration of Independence, and you know, that all are created equal, and that it's to be, you know, self-government by all of us, and so I think it's an important time to bring home those ideals.
Well, it's we are still in a polarized time, and I want to thank both of you for being here. I want to thank my co-host Brent as well for the work both that we're doing together, but also this conversation. And I want to, you know, I think it's really important for us to have the data and the analysis that you've put on the table to help us understand how we've gotten here. I think it's our joint project to think about how do we go forward and maybe bring us to some more political equilibrium rather than the divide that we're facing right now. But thanks very much to the audience. Thanks for those of you being here, for your great questions. And thank you, Suzanne and Trevor, for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.